October 14, 1943, 24,000 feet above Schweinfurt, Germany. Hetman Heinz Knoke gripped the controls of his Messerschmitt Bf 109 G6 with gloved hands, eyes fixed on a sight that defied conventional understanding. His diary entry, penned later that evening and part of a personal record he had maintained since 1941, revealed a mixture of wonder and deep foreboding. The sky was filled to capacity with enemy bombers. The scale of the formation was overwhelming, stretching from one horizon to the other, and it made even experienced Luftwaffe pilots feel insignificant. Across the autumn sky, 291 Boeing B-17 Flying Fortresses of the U.S. 8th Air Force advanced in tightly coordinated combat box formations, spanning altitudes from 23,000 to 27,000 feet. The early sunlight reflected off their polished aluminum hulls, creating the illusion of a vast silver river flowing toward the heart of Germany. Each bomber was armed with 13 50 caliber machine guns, forming a defensive lattice capable of turning the skies into a deadly gauntlet. It was not merely the number of aircraft that chilled Heinz Knoke. He had faced large bomber formations before. What struck fear into the hearts of German pilots was the realization that these 291 bombers likely represented only a fraction of the American heavy bomber fleet stationed in England. Only a day prior, his squadron had participated in what the Luftwaffe celebrated as their most successful single-day interception. 60 American bombers were destroyed in the first Schweinfurt raid. Yet the Americans returned with even more aircraft, showing an industrial resilience that German pilots could scarcely comprehend. The evolution of strategic air warfare had begun over a year ago, though its implications were initially underestimated by German command. In January 1942, the first B-17 Flying Fortresses of the 97th Bombardment Group arrived in England. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring had dismissed their significance, claiming that American pilots lacked skill and that the aircraft themselves were fragile and unsuitable for combat. Major Johannes Mache Steinhoff, leading JG-77 in North Africa at the time, later described this underestimation as one of the most disastrous intelligence miscalculations of the war. American aircraft, he noted, were engineered with remarkable durability, modular construction, and simplified systems, qualities that allowed for mass production on a scale unprecedented in Europe. The initial signs were evident on August 17, 1942, when 18 B-17s attacked the Rouen-Soutteville marshalling yards in France. Hetman Rudolf Plantz, commanding 11.JG-2, a high-altitude unit equipped with pressurized Bf 109 G1 fighters, engaged these bombers before his death in July of that year. His after-action reports, later recovered from Luftwaffe archives, highlighted the resilience of the American aircraft. Despite sustaining heavy damage, formations remained intact, and defensive fire from the bombers was lethal and highly coordinated. Yet it was the scale of production that truly unnerved German commanders. Those 18 bombers represented barely 2 days' output from U.S. factories, while Germany's entire aircraft industry in 1942 produced only 15,000 planes across all types: fighters, bombers, transports, and trainers combined. By contrast, the Boeing plant in Seattle was on track to produce 16 B-17s per day by mid-1944. The mission of October 14, 1943, aimed at crippling Schweinfurt's ball bearing factories, would later be remembered by Americans as Black Thursday, resulting in the loss of 60 bombers and 650 crew members. For the Luftwaffe, it was paradoxically both their greatest triumph and the moment that crystallized the harsh reality. The war in the air was already shifting beyond Germany's ability to respond. Oberleutnant Hans Philipp, leading JG-1, shot down 2 B-17s before being felled by defensive fire from a third. His wingman, Feldwebel Stefan Lydians, survived and later recounted Philipp's final radio transmission, a testament to the bravery and vulnerability of the Luftwaffe's finest pilots. By mid-1943, the American Air Force's confronting Germany had transformed dramatically. 6 months earlier, Luftwaffe pilots had been able to challenge bomber formations effectively, but the nature of the threat had evolved. The American gunners had become exceptionally precise, their formations resilient under intense anti-aircraft fire. Reports from Berlin suggested that these developments were only the early stages of an escalating aerial campaign. During one notable engagement, the Luftwaffe claimed the destruction of 60 Allied bombers and damage to 17 more, marking their most successful single day of the conflict to that point. Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels presented this as evidence of Fortress Europe's supposed invulnerability. Yet pilots who had pressed through the defensive fire knew the reality was starkly different. Their squadrons had exhausted nearly 90% of their ammunition, suffered the loss of 38 fighters, incurred damage to 30 more, and had 28 pilots killed or wounded, almost a quarter of the attacking force. The most alarming aspect was the rapid American response. Within 48 hours, reconnaissance planes had assessed damage at the Schweinfurt industrial facilities. Less than a week later, 240 replacement B-17 bombers had arrived in England directly from the United States. Within 2 weeks, the 8th Air Force launched a follow-up mission involving 378 bombers, exceeding the size of the initial attack.
Major Wilhelm Ferdinand Witz Galland, brother of famed ace Adolf Galland and commander within JG-26, reflected in his diary, "We are like Sisyphus. Each bomber we destroy is replaced by 2. Each pilot we lose is substituted by inexperienced young men with only 20 hours in a fighter." The Americans suffer losses, yet their training pipeline produces thousands more. We lose experienced men and are forced to scrape the bottom of the barrel. The winter of 1943-1944 provided a temporary lull in deep penetration raids due to adverse weather. However, it also brought sobering intelligence to Luftwaffe leadership. Captured documents revealed industrial capacities far beyond what German experts had deemed possible. At the Ford Willow Run plant in Michigan, production achievements astonished observers. The factory spanned 3.5 million square feet, employed 42,000 workers, and produced a fully assembled B-24 Liberator every 63 minutes around the clock. Over the course of the program, this facility alone was expected to generate 6,972 complete bombers, plus kits for another 1,893, totaling 8,865 aircraft. In December 1943, Oberst Joseph Priller of JG-26 obtained an American technical manual. His report to Fighter Command highlighted the formidable capabilities of the latest B-17G variant 13 machine guns, including a chin turret designed specifically to thwart frontal attacks, illustrating that the Americans had anticipated and planned for every contingency. Production across the United States was staggering. Boeing plants in Seattle and Wichita approached 363 B-17s per month at peak output. Douglas facilities in Long Beach and Oklahoma City contributed 400 B-24s. Consolidated plants in San Diego and Fort Worth added another 300, while Martin in Baltimore produced 200 B-26s. North American Aviation in Kansas City delivered 400 B-25 fighters, and Republic in Long Island manufactured 400 P-47 fighters monthly. By comparison, Germany's total single-engine fighter output in late 1943 averaged 1,600 per month, and actual deliveries were often reduced due to Allied bombing of factories. Operation Argument, later remembered as Big Week in February 1944, confirmed the magnitude of American air power and shattered remaining Luftwaffe illusions. On February 20th, Commander Hedmund Heintar of JJ-1 departed Rena Airfield to intercept radar-detected formations from the west. Ascending to 20,000 feet, he confronted an overwhelming force, 1,031 American heavy bombers escorted by 835 fighters, stretching across the horizon. He wrote later that night, "I have witnessed Germany's end. The sky was dark with them." His 12 fighters engaged what seemed like an endless formation. Perhaps 6 bombers were downed, barely making a dent. During Big Week, the Americans flew 3,800 bomber sorties and 2,500 fighter sorties, losing 226 bombers and 28 fighters. Losses quickly replenished within 2 weeks. The Luftwaffe, by contrast, lost 262 fighters and suffered nearly 100 pilot fatalities, approximately 14% of its combat-ready pilot force. These losses were irreplaceable. Fuel shortages and instructor scarcity in training schools meant new pilots often had less than 50 hours of total flight experience. The disparity in production, training, and operational depth was becoming painfully clear, leaving Germany's air defenses increasingly vulnerable. Lieutenant Hannes Trautloft, responsible for evaluating day fighter operations, produced a scathing assessment of the Luftwaffe's capabilities. According to his findings, the average American aviator entered combat with over 200 hours of flight experience, including roughly 75 hours in the aircraft type they would be flying in battle. In contrast, newly trained German pilots had accumulated only around 40 hours overall, and perhaps 10 hours in a frontline fighter. Trautloft concluded grimly, these newcomers were not combat-ready pilots. They were essentially expendable.
The turning point came on March 4, 1944. On that day, American P-51 Mustang fighters made their debut over Berlin. The 4th Fighter Group, flying P-51B Mustangs, accompanied a formation of bombers on an 1,100-mile round trip to strike the German capital. The psychological impact on German forces was immediate and profound. Major G.A. Rahl, commanding 3 JG-11 units and Germany's 3rd highest scoring ace with 275 confirmed victories, faced Mustangs for the first time on March 6th during a follow-up mission. His combat report, preserved in the Bundesarchiv, highlighted the unprecedented challenge posed by these aircraft. Rahl noted that the P-51 outperformed the Bf-109G across all altitudes, handled more nimbly, dove with greater speed, and possessed virtually unlimited ammunition compared to the Bf-109's mere 60 seconds of cannon fire. Most crucially, the Mustangs could escort bombers throughout Germany, a capability the Luftwaffe had no counter for. The extended range of the Mustang, provided by its Packard-built Merlin engine and laminar flow wings, allowed it to accompany bombers up to 1,650 miles with drop tanks, engaging in combat for nearly half an hour over target zones. German pilots, who'd been trained to intercept bombers once their escorts turned back at the edge of their operational range, now found themselves confronted by fresh, well-rested American fighters over distant locations such as Prague, Vienna, and Warsaw. Veteran pilot Lieutenant Franz Stogler, who'd flown 487 combat missions, described the new reality in a letter to his brother. Mustangs lurked above like predators, diving with extreme speed, often exceeding 500 miles per hour on German interceptors attempting to reach the bombers. If German pilots chased the bombers, the Mustangs attacked from behind, leaving little room for maneuver. The result was a systematic attrition of German forces. By April 1944, the 8th Air Force routinely conducted raids of 1,000 bombers supported by 800 fighters, repeatedly overwhelming German defenses. The mathematics of defeat were straightforward and unavoidable.
On April 27, 1944, General Adolf Galland, commander of the Luftwaffe's fighter forces, presented a sobering report to Hitler. American aircraft production had surged to over 3,000 bombers and more than 4,000 fighters per month, while pilot training produced over 30,000 graduates monthly. German production lagged significantly, around 1,600 fighters per month, reduced further by Allied bombing, and only 500 newly trained pilots whose preparation was insufficient for modern combat. Meanwhile, Luftwaffe losses exceeded 400 pilots monthly. Galland summed up the dilemma to Hitler. For every bomber shot down, the Americans sent 3 more. For each fighter lost, 5 replacements followed. The Luftwaffe was no longer confronting an enemy air force. It was facing a massive, industrially powered aerial war machine.
Hitler's reaction, as recounted in Galland's memoirs, was outrage. He accused pilots of cowardice and betrayal, issuing orders for relentless attacks, even instructing pilots to ram enemy bombers if necessary. This policy accelerated the loss of experienced, irreplaceable airmen. Individual accounts from Luftwaffe pilots during this period highlight the mental and emotional strain of fighting an unwinnable battle. HPTM Robert Wiese, leading JG-54 with 121 confirmed victories, was shot down and killed by P-51s on December 29, 1944. His last letter, written to his wife the night before, described the dwindling resources and exhausted airmen. New trainees could barely handle basic flight, let alone combat. With only 6 operational fighters, his unit faced hundreds of bombers and their escorts, a scenario he described as execution rather than war. Feldwebel Rudi Müller, maintenance chief of JG-3, meticulously recorded the decline in aircraft readiness. 67% of fighters were operational in January 1944, falling to 45% by March due to spare parts shortages, 31% in May as fuel scarcity hindered test flights, and a mere 18% by July. "We cannibalized 3 planes to keep 1 flying," he noted. Even when American raids inflicted relatively minor losses, around 50 aircraft, the Luftwaffe experienced crippling disruptions, with just 5 German planes lost temporarily, debilitating a squadron. Strategic bombing on fuel production caused cascading failures, magnifying the numerical superiority of American forces and ensuring the Luftwaffe's gradual but irreversible collapse. By May 1944, Allied attacks on Germany's synthetic oil facilities had brought aviation fuel production to a near standstill, plummeting from 180,000 tons per month to just 20,000 tons. During this period, Oberstleutnant Hermann Graf, Germany's 9th highest-scoring ace with 212 confirmed kills, commanded JG-11. His unit's logbooks detail the increasingly desperate measures taken to conserve fuel. Training flights were limited and termed progressive paralysis. Combat sorties were restricted to 30 to 45 minutes, and aircraft were often kept fully armed, yet grounded due to fuel shortages. Pilots were explicitly forbidden from chasing damaged bombers, as even a single extra maneuver could deplete precious fuel. Graf himself described the situation starkly. German fighters could only manage 1 attack pass on Allied bombers before being forced into a withdrawal. Any attempt to engage escort fighters risked leaving them unable to reach the bombers, and attacking the bombers left them vulnerable to the escorts. In essence, German pilots were set up for failure before even leaving the ground. Meanwhile, the Americans consumed approximately 20 million gallons of aviation fuel monthly in the European theater alone, more than Germany produced for all military purposes combined. On June 6, 1944, D-Day, the Allied invasion of Normandy showcased the overwhelming air power of the United States. Only a handful of German fighter pilots, including Oberst Joseph Pips Prieler of JG-26, attempted to strike the landing beaches. Prieler and his wingman, Unteroffizier Wodacek, conducted a single strafing run on Sword Beach before retreating under the weight of superior Allied numbers. The question, "Where is the Luftwaffe?" was answered in the most sobering terms.
Germany had just 319 serviceable fighters in France and Belgium to oppose a staggering 11,590 Allied aircraft. On D-Day alone, American forces launched 8,722 sorties, while the Luftwaffe could field only 319. Oberlieutenant Harold Quandt, stationed at Le Mans with 2x JG-26, recorded the day in his diary. "We sat in our shelters listening to the radio. Thousands of ships, thousands of planes. Only 7 of our fighters were operational. Our squadron commander forbade us from taking off. It would have been murder, not combat."
The arrival of the Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighter in mid-1944 briefly offered a glimmer of hope. With a maximum speed of 540 miles per hour, roughly 100 miles per hour faster than any Allied fighter, it promised a potential reversal of air dominance. Major Walter Notny, in charge of the world's first jet fighter unit, Kommando Notny, initially believed the Me-262 could regain the initiative. However, after 2 months of operations, he reported a sobering reality to Adolf Galland. The jets were revolutionary but far too scarce and arrived too late. Only 30 Me-262s were operational. On a day when 1,500 American bombers and 800 fighters struck, even 1,000 Me-262s might have made a difference. As it was, the Luftwaffe could hope for no more than 100 by year's end. Notny himself was killed on November 8, 1944, shot down by a P-51 Mustang while attempting to land his damaged Me-262. His final radio words, "I'm burning, too many of them." By the end of the war, Germany produced 1,430 Me-262s, of which only around 300 ever saw combat, compared with 15,000 P-51 Mustangs built by the Americans. Surviving German aces have provided critical insight into the psychological strain of confronting the American war machine. General Adolf Galland reflected in his post-war memoirs, The First and the Last. "By mid-1944, I realized the war was lost. This was no longer about tactics, courage, or technology. It was pure arithmetic. They could lose 100 planes and replace them within days. We lost 10 and never got them back." Major Erich Hartmann, history's highest-scoring ace with 352 victories, primarily fought on the Eastern Front until 1945, but upon transfer to the Western Front, he encountered American bomber formations for the first time. He recalled, "I had shot down dozens of Soviet planes, but the Americans were different. They flew in precise formations, hundreds strong. Their defensive fire created a wall of tracers. They stayed organized even under attack, even while burning, even while dying. This wasn't heroism, it was industrial warfare." Oberst Johannes Steinhoff, who flew 993 missions and scored 176 victories, later became Chief of Staff of the post-war Luftwaffe and NATO's Military Committee. His assessment emphasized the imbalance. "We were skilled artisans fighting an industrial machine. Each German pilot trained for years, each aircraft hand-built. The Americans produced pilots and planes like cars. We shot down one B-17, 10 more took its place. They shot down a Bf-109, and it was gone forever." By autumn 1944, the Luftwaffe's collapse was not solely due to combat losses, but systematic shortages of fuel, trained pilots, spare parts, and morale. Major Heinz Knoke, commanding JG-1 in the war's final year with 220 victories, recorded the grim reality in September 1944. "We have 40 pilots and 12 operational aircraft. Yesterday, 10 replacements arrived. None had more than 50 flight hours. 3 crashed on landing, 2 died. This is the state of the Luftwaffe."
In less than a year, Germany's once formidable air force was reduced to a shadow of itself, overwhelmed not only by superior numbers, but by the relentless industrial capacity of the Allies, which rendered skill, experience, and heroism increasingly irrelevant. October 1944. Fuel allocations for the Luftwaffe were slashed by 3/4. Under these conditions, a single operational sortie could only be flown once every 3 days. Meanwhile, American bombing raids occurred almost daily.
November 1944. Orders came down instructing pilots to engage in ramming attacks against bombers if ammunition ran out. Unlike the Japanese, whose kamikaze attacks were grounded in a long-standing martial tradition, German airmen were being asked to sacrifice their lives for a cause increasingly recognized as futile. December 1944. An enormous American raid of around 1,000 bombers arrived. The Luftwaffe had only 4 aircraft ready to fly. No interception could be mounted. The disparity in capability rendered defense effectively meaningless. January 1, 1945. Operation Bodenplatte, the final significant Luftwaffe offensive in the West, starkly demonstrated the limits of German air power against American industrial might. Nearly 900 fighters were assembled for a surprise strike against Allied airfields, the largest German air operation in over a year. They succeeded in destroying 305 Allied aircraft, primarily on the ground. However, the Allies simply replaced these losses within days, maintaining uninterrupted operations. German losses were severe: 271 aircraft destroyed and 143 pilots killed or missing, including senior officers whose experience could not be replaced. Oberst Lieutenant Dietrich Peltz, the architect of the operation, later reflected, "In a single morning, we inflicted more damage than in 3 previous months, yet it changed nothing. The Allies recovered everything swiftly. The pilots we lost were irreplaceable. In truth, we handed ourselves a fatal blow." February 1945. By this point, the Luftwaffe's capacity to respond was negligible. Large-scale raids by the Allies devastated German cities with near-total impunity. On February 3, 1945, an American formation of 1,437 B-17 and B-24 bombers, escorted by 948 fighters, attacked Berlin in broad daylight. The Luftwaffe managed to launch only 28 fighters, 23 of which were destroyed. Lieutenant Walter Hagina, flying one of the survivors, recalled the encounter. Approaching the bomber formation felt like flying into a cloud composed entirely of metal and lethal intent. Escort fighters swarmed above and around the bombers. Pilots made a single attack run, firing their guns, then retreated, uncertain whether they had inflicted any damage at all. The overwhelming numbers rendered individual efforts meaningless. March 1945. By this stage, the scale of American industrial production was impossible to counter. Intelligence indicated that in 1944 alone, the United States produced 96,318 aircraft, 35,000 4-engine heavy bombers, and 38,873 fighters. German production for the same period totaled only 39,978 aircraft, including 25,285 fighters, many of which never became operational due to fuel shortages, lack of trained pilots, or missing parts. Germany had briefly peaked in fighter production in autumn 1944 before Allied attacks on synthetic fuel plants sharply reduced output. Major Wolfgang Fahl, who had established the Luftwaffe's night fighter units, quantified the impact. 1.46 million tons of bombs were dropped on Germany by American forces, equivalent to 33 Hiroshima-style explosions. Bombing accuracy steadily improved with advanced radar and navigation systems, allowing up to 90% of bombs to fall within 1,000 feet of the target from altitudes of 25,000 feet. Fahl noted that warfare had been transformed into arithmetic. The number of tons of bombs dictated destruction. The number of aircraft determined air superiority. The number of trained pilots determined victory. The Luftwaffe was not so much defeated in battle as methodically calculated out of the fight. April 1945. At this point, the Luftwaffe's existence was largely theoretical. Out of 1,500 fighters nominally available, perhaps 50 could fly on any given day. Oberst Gordon Golob, a 150 victory ace, was appointed to lead the air defense of the Reich. He encountered insurmountable shortages, no fuel for missions, no ammunition, no pilots, insufficient parts, and airfields under constant bombardment. His only directive was to preserve what remained, protect aircraft for museums, safeguard pilots for their families. The war was effectively over. Post-war testimonies of Luftwaffe pilots revealed the psychological toll of confronting American air power. Generalleutnant Josef Schmid, the final commander of Luftwaffe Command West, testified to the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey that from 1943 onward, German pilots fought not for victory, but to delay defeat. Each sortie meant facing overwhelming odds, often 10-1 or worse. Major Georg Peter Ader, credited with 78 victories including 36 four-engine bombers, described the evolution of German pilot thinking. In 1943, he believed skill and tactics could win. By early 1944, he realized only miracle weapons might succeed. By late 1944, the situation demanded an actual miracle. Final statistics of the air war underscore the imbalance. American aircraft production 1942 to 1945, 300,000 total, 35,000 heavy bombers, 99,950 fighters. Trained pilots, 800,000. German aircraft production 1942 to 1945, 119,971 total, 1,194 heavy bombers, 53,729 fighters. Trained pilots, 28,000. Combat losses, Americans lost 18,369 aircraft, 6.1% of production. Germans lost 57,000, 48%. Aircrew casualties, American 94,565, 11.8% of trained, German 44,651, 157% of trained, reflecting repeated missions by surviving pilots. By May 1945, the Luftwaffe was all but annihilated. The United States had 41,163 operational aircraft, while Germany had fewer than 100. Surviving German pilots experienced profound psychological transformation, from confident veterans of campaigns across Europe to men concealing their planes under trees, hoping to preserve fuel for a single last mission. Hetman Franz von Bohra, the sole German pilot to escape Allied captivity and return home, had already warned Göring in 1941 about American industrial potential, a warning that was ignored. The Luftwaffe entered the war as one of the most formidable air forces in history and ended it barely able to lift a handful of planes from the ground. A high-ranking official of the Reich once accused me of being influenced by foreign propaganda, unable to grasp the scale of Allied industrial capability. Hans-Ulrich Rudel, the Luftwaffe's most highly decorated pilot, conducted 2,530 combat sorties, mostly on the Eastern Front, but also encountered American air power in 1945. His reflections on the conflict were blunt. The Soviets relied on sheer numbers, while the Americans combined quantity with impeccable quality. Every American bomber and fighter was meticulously maintained, while their crews were well-fed, well-rested, and extensively trained. In contrast, German pilots were often underage, flying worn-out planes and struggling with hunger, sent repeatedly into overwhelming opposition. Major Heinz Knoke, who completed 2,000 missions and scored 33 victories, kept precise records of the evolving balance of forces over the war years. In 1943, intercepting bomber formations of 60 to 100 aircraft was perilous, but achievable with 20 to 30 fighters. By early 1944, the Americans were sending 200 to 300 bombers protected by roughly 100 escort fighters, demanding maximum effort from all available Luftwaffe units. Late in 1944, formations swelled to 500 to 750 bombers with 400 escorts, while German forces often had just a dozen aircraft fit to fly. By 1945, raids exceeded 1,000 bombers supported by 800 fighters.
Luftwaffe pilots sometimes remained grounded, watching from the airfields as enemy waves passed overhead. Knoke's last entry on May 7, 1945, concluded 1/10 of the American arsenal would have sufficed for victory. They simply chose to demonstrate total power, and the demonstration was absolute. Perhaps no account illustrates the Luftwaffe's recognition of defeat more clearly than a secretly recorded statement by General Oberst Hans-Jürgen Stumpf, head of Air Fleet Reich, made in May 1945 to fellow prisoners captured by British intelligence. He stated plainly, "The Allies did not conquer us through superior bravery or piloting skill. American courage matched our own, and their pilots were competent, but not exceptional compared to the Luftwaffe's elite. What defeated us was the sheer magnitude of their industrial and logistical machinery. In a single month, the Americans produced more aircraft than Germany could in an entire year. They trained new pilots in days, what we required 6 months to accomplish. One bombing mission often delivered more explosives than Germany had dropped on Britain throughout the entire conflict."
Stumpf's assessment framed the war as an industrial contest rather than a conventional fight. American society had been mobilized entirely as a war machine. Women who once assembled household appliances now produced aircraft components, and men previously building cars were constructing bombers. Their approach to warfare mirrored their approach to business: measured, calculated, and relentlessly efficient. The Luftwaffe fought with skill and valor, but the Americans executed with the precision of an industrialized process. The precision, not passion, decided the outcome. Many Luftwaffe pilots recalled distinct moments when defeat became undeniable. Allison described a relentless chain of bombers, 7 combat boxes of 54 aircraft each, pouring over their positions during one raid, with multiple similar waves that same day. Landing and reporting to his commander, he said, "The war is already lost. We simply haven't realized it yet." Wilhelm Butz of JG-52 in April 1944 remembered shooting down 11 B-17s in one sortie, only to see the next day's raid arriving with 50 more bombers than before, making their previous success seem inconsequential. Major Klaus Mittich of JG-26 in September 1944 witnessed a B-17 with 2 engines destroyed, a shattered tail, yet still operational and deadly, shooting down 2 of their most skilled pilots. Even crippled American aircraft remained formidable, underscoring the lethal combination of resilience, numbers, and industrial backing. These first-hand observations, memoirs, and letters collectively revealed the psychological strain imposed on German aviators as they faced an adversary whose power was measured not only in courage and technique, but in the unstoppable force of industrial production and logistical mastery. American technological innovation during World War II steadily outpaced that of Germany, creating a widening disparity in air power. Each successive U.S. aircraft model brought tangible advancements over its predecessor. In contrast, German aircraft development suffered from resource shortages and stagnation. By late 1943, the American B-17G exemplified these innovations. It featured a Bendix chin turret with twin .50 caliber machine guns, an upgraded Nordam bomb sight integrated with autopilot, electronic superchargers for reliable high-altitude performance, radar navigation aids, and chaff dispensers to counter German radar detection. Meanwhile, German fighter designs were increasingly simplified to accelerate production. Cockpit heating systems were removed, electric controls replaced by manual mechanisms, substitute materials substituted for scarce aluminum, armor was reduced to save weight, and radios were omitted in trainer aircraft. Oberlieutenant Heinrich Ehrler, who would ultimately record 208 aerial victories, lamented the widening gap. Month by month, American planes improve. Each month, ours deteriorate. They increase firepower, we strip armor. They upgrade engines, we dilute fuel. They enhance electronics, we take radios away. We are falling behind while they surge forward. Pilot training further underscored Germany's declining ability to compete. By 1944, American aviators logged over 200 total flight hours before entering combat, including more than 75 hours in their operational aircraft type, 50 hours of gunnery practice, and 40 hours of formation flying.
They trained with unlimited fuel and under no combat stress. German pilots, by contrast, received only 110 to 160 hours of flight time, a dramatic reduction from 450 hours in 1921. Of these, just 15 to 20 hours were spent in operational aircraft, 5 hours on gunnery, and none on formation flying. Fuel shortages and constant attacks on training fields further hampered their preparation. In December 1944, Oberst Lieutenant Hans Trautloft, inspector of fighter pilots, reported, "We are dispatching boys to their deaths. They cannot fly competently, much less engage the enemy. They fail to maintain formation, cannot aim properly, and often cannot land safely. Out of 10 new pilots assigned, 8 are dead within 2 weeks."
By late 1944, morale among Luftwaffe pilots had collapsed entirely. Suicide rates soared by 400%. Desertion, previously almost unheard of, became widespread, and some airmen intentionally sabotaged their aircraft to avoid missions. Secret SS reports from the period, later declassified, revealed the depth of the crisis. SS Bundesführer Wilhelm Domberg noted in December 1944, "Fighter pilots openly declare the war is lost. Combat sorties are described as suicide missions. Some even fire their ammunition over friendly territory to claim false victories. Propaganda and punishments are powerless. The pilots have seen the enemy's overwhelming strength firsthand." In response, the Luftwaffe resorted to increasingly extreme measures. Sturmgruppen units were tasked with ramming bombers. Specialized Raumjäger squads were formed for suicidal attacks. Court-martials for cowardice increased eightfold, and families of pilots faced threats of concentration camp internment. Yet none of these strategies reversed the decline. March 18, 1945 marked a humiliating nadir. Over 2,000 American bombers and fighters assaulted Berlin during daylight. The Luftwaffe could only muster 37 fighters to defend the city. The newly deployed Me-262 jets managed to down 8 bombers, while their escorts shot down 25 German planes, including 5 jets. Adolf Galland, flying a Me-262 with the elite JV-44 squadron, composed of Germany's highest-scoring aces, described the mission. "We took off knowing our efforts were futile. Each of us, Barkhorn, Hohagen, Kinski, Luto, had over 100 kills, collectively more than 1,000 enemy aircraft, yet we could achieve nothing. We were mere insects, facing an avalanche." By April 1945, the Luftwaffe was effectively incapacitated. American bombers, now flying with unpainted aluminum finishes, no longer required camouflage or evasive maneuvers, and could follow direct flight paths to targets. Fighter escorts were often deemed unnecessary. Reports from the 8th Air Force in April 1945 noted, "No enemy aircraft encountered, no flak encountered, target destroyed without opposition. Mission resembled a training exercise." Sortie numbers reflected this collapse. In May 1940, during the Battle of France, Germany flew 5,000 sorties daily. In August 1940, during the Battle of Britain, 3,000. On D-Day, June 1944, 319. By March 1945, only 50 to 100 sorties daily. And in May 1945, fewer than 10 sorties daily. Following Germany's surrender, the United States Strategic Bombing Survey conducted interviews with hundreds of Luftwaffe personnel. Declassified in the 1960s, these testimonies provide a stark assessment of American industrial supremacy. General Feld Marshal Erhard Milch, Inspector General of the Luftwaffe, observed, "We knew from intelligence that by 1944, the U.S. was producing 8,000 aircraft per month. The scale of what we were facing was almost unimaginable. At the peak of autumn in 1944, we managed to field close to 4,000 aircraft in a single month, our record high. Yet intelligence reports had gravely underestimated our enemy. The Americans were producing aircraft at a staggering pace, 9,000 per month. It was a sobering question.
How could any nation hope to contend with an opponent that manufactured in 2 months what would take you 2 years to produce? General Jürgen Stumpf, one of the Luftwaffe's top commanders, expressed the bitter truth. The Americans demonstrated that modern warfare relies far more on industrial output than individual heroism.
Every bomber that crossed into German skies was the result of countless hours of labor in factories, refineries, and mines. We were not merely engaging enemy pilots in aerial combat, we were confronting the collective productivity of cities like Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Seattle. The statistics underscore the enormity of the challenge. Bomber production. Between 1941 and 1945, the U.S. built 35,040 heavy bombers, whereas Germany managed only 1,194, nearly a 30-to-1 disadvantage. Fighter aircraft. During the same period, the U.S. produced 99,950 fighters, Germany 53,729, giving the Americans nearly a 2-to-1 advantage. Pilot training. American pilots averaged over 200 hours of training before entering combat. German pilots, by 1944, had between 110 and 160 hours, placing them at a significant disadvantage. Fuel supplies. U.S. forces had virtually unlimited access, while Germany's fuel stockpiles fell to only about 10% of their needs by 1945. Sortie rates. By the end of the war, U.S. bombers could fly over 8,000 sorties per day, compared to Germany's 100, an 80-to-1 ratio. The psychological toll on German airmen was profound and enduring. Many later suffered from what would eventually be classified as post-traumatic stress disorder, not simply from the dangers of combat, but from witnessing their country's inability to match industrial power. Dr. Hans Joachim Lehmann, who served as a Luftwaffe medical officer and later became a psychiatrist, studied these veterans in the 1950s. He observed a distinctive trauma among them. They were haunted not just by what they endured, but by the futility of their struggle. They watched their comrades fall to an enemy seemingly impervious to losses and saw the impotence of their own nation's war effort firsthand. Their experience was not one of defeat in battle, but of systemic irrelevance. A 1962 reunion of former Luftwaffe pilots in Munich highlighted these lessons. Adolf Galland, a prominent speaker, reflected on the profound implications of confronting U.S. air power. He noted that in contemporary warfare, the production line outweighs the airfield. The factory is more decisive than the battlefield, and the laborer's contribution surpasses that of the soldier. The Americans demonstrated that a democratic industrial system could outproduce a totalitarian state, overwhelming Germany with sheer volume of resources and manufacturing capability. Yet there was a broader lesson. After the war, the United States did not merely defeat Germany, it aided in its reconstruction. By protecting the nation from Soviet influence and supporting its economic recovery, America transformed former enemies into allies. Their greatest achievement was not the sheer quantity of aircraft they produced, but the decision to wield that power constructively rather than vindictively. On April 26, 1985, Johannes Steinhoff, former Luftwaffe ace and later NATO commander, addressed cadets at the U.S. Air Force Academy on the 40th anniversary of his capture. He described the experience of facing American air power, watching the sky fill with relentless bombers, measuring your ammunition in fleeting minutes while your opponent's supplies lasted for hours, and witnessing seasoned comrades vanish in mere moments. Beyond the immediate danger, he emphasized, it was a lesson in the overwhelming capability of a society mobilized for industrial war. Every aircraft over Germany was a reflection of American workforce, resources, and determination. The disparity was staggering. We tallied our planes in mere dozens, while they counted theirs in thousands. We rationed fuel in liters, they measured it in oceans. In the end,
Confronting U.S. air power revealed a truth that extended far beyond tactics and strategy. The modern battlefield is as much a contest of economies, factories, and civic organization as it is of courage or skill in combat. And in that measure, the Americans' triumph was total, not only in war, but in the peace and stability they fostered afterward.
The key insight from World War II is not that the United States prevailed solely because it possessed wealth. Rather, it is that America was able to harness that wealth effectively because it was a free society. In a system built on liberty, workers contributed their labor with greater efficiency than coerced or enslaved populations. Private enterprise produced more quickly and flexibly than centralized, state-run programs. Individuals with freedom and initiative ultimately surpassed even the most disciplined and ideologically driven foes. I personally participated in nearly 1,000 aerial missions, engaging in dogfights that claimed 176 enemy aircraft. I was downed on a dozen occasions. Yet the mission that had the deepest impact on me was fought not in the skies, but in the realm of thought and understanding. It was the gradual transformation from seeing the world through the lens of a devoted Nazi to embracing the principles of democratic citizenship, from considering others as enemies to recognizing them as future partners, and from the bitter aftermath of defeat to genuine comprehension. To the young Americans listening today, the victories of your forebears went beyond mere military conquest. They reshaped entire societies. They demonstrated that true strength lies not in domination, but in productivity, not in ideology, but in capability, not in animosity, but in compassion. The destruction wrought by bombing was immense, yet the reconstruction that followed was profound in its transformative power. Those of us who once clashed in the skies as adversaries now gather as friends in the same space. This transformation, above all, exemplifies the real triumph of the United States. The story of the Luftwaffe acknowledging its defeat is ultimately a testament to industrial might. It was the relentless, undeniable output of a free nation mobilized for total war.
When Headman Heinz Knoke gazed skyward at the 291 B-17 bombers over Schweinfurt on October 14, 1943, he was observing far more than a tactical formation. He was witnessing the tangible arithmetic of Germany's impending loss. Each bomber represented the labor of American hands, from the 1.2 million rivets set by skilled workers to the thousands of precision-engineered components comprising each engine. Each crew member embodied hundreds of hours of rigorous training. Multiply these numbers across hundreds of missions, and the scale of the challenge became insurmountable. The Luftwaffe boasted some of the finest pilots in aviation history. Many had over 100 confirmed kills. A few exceeded 200, with Erich Hartmann reaching 352. Yet, individual valor and technical prowess could not offset the sheer force of American production. Bravery alone was insufficient to counterbalance statistics, and exceptional skill could not outmatch industrial throughput. Every German pilot who looked up at the seemingly endless wave of aluminum aircraft grasped a stark truth. They were confronting not an air force alone, but a fully mobilized nation whose output could replace losses faster than they could inflict them. The decisive moment of the war came not from tactics in the air, but from the moment U.S. industry reached its peak capacity. The Luftwaffe's aviators were merely the first to perceive this reality, written across the sky in rows of flying fortresses stretching from one horizon to the other. This vast stream of aircraft carried not only explosives, but a clear mathematical statement of Germany's eventual defeat. Hundreds of bombers confirmed to their observers that victory was slipping from their grasp, not because of the destruction these planes caused, but because of what they symbolized, the unstoppable industrial capability of a democracy fully mobilized. Recognition of this fact contained within it both defeat and a form of redemption. Through this confrontation, German pilots saw not only the might of American arms, but also the purpose behind it. They witnessed a power directed toward liberation rather than subjugation, toward rebuilding rather than revenge, toward hope rather than hate. The industrial verdict had been rendered. The Luftwaffe observed it, internalized it, and through this awareness came to understand a principle that would shape the post-war world. A democratic society capable of massive production was the most formidable force on the planet, and the United States had become its repository.